Welcome to the Nations of Sanity. Once again, I'm talking with Daniel Scott. Our previous conversation can be seen in the link in the description of this video. Also, I'll put in a link to a conversation we had a couple of years ago on Daniel's previous podcast, which was called Flagship Freedom, and we speak about that in our previous conversation. And Daniel has very kindly agreed to come back and speak to me more specifically about the issue of land ownership, the environment, environmental protection, and how that all kind of fits together under the scope of voluntarism and how it would work in a free society. And just because I like to make all these videos have a certain standalone quality, I'm just going to very quickly introduce voluntarism, myself, Dan, and the Nations of Sanity that I represent. So for anyone who's listening to this who isn't already familiar, voluntarism is basically an ideology similar to anarchism. In fact, for many, it'd be interchangeable with anarchism. And basically, the idea is that all interactions should be voluntary. It's built on the premise of self-ownership, and the idea that you own yourself. And from that, the principle of the non-aggression principle is basically the objective and universal standard of morality that comes from that premise, because any violation of your self-ownership is a violation of the non-aggression principle, and according to the non-aggression principle would be an act of aggression against you and basically a crime. And more specifically, the Nations of Sanity represents a kind of specific flavour of voluntarism, where we propose that the only way to both create and define a free society is by establishing the non-aggression principle as the law, which we propose doing through a peace agreement, specifically a three-part peace agreement. I apologise if anyone who already knows all of this. I apologise. Like I say, I just like to make it so that all these videos have a standalone quality. So anyone watching this that hasn't seen other videos at least has a rough idea of what we're talking about. In our previous discussions, me and Dan have covered a lot of areas with regards to voluntarism and how different things are affected. And one area we're kind of sort of focusing on today is the issue of environmental protection and land ownership. But before we get into that, I just want to say thank you to Dan for taking the time to have this conversation.
Oh, my pleasure, Matt. No need.
Thanks very much. And right, we might as well just get straight into it. So I did give you a little preview of my kind of position on land ownership, and you obviously are kind of familiar with things I've said with regards to environmental protection before. But just to kind of introduce it again for people that are listening, because one of the things that often comes up when people sort of question the non-aggression principle or question the idea of voluntarism is the idea of the environment and where that kind of stands in that scope, because obviously it's pretty clear from the outset that the non-aggression principle prohibits that we aggress against other people, and that's obviously clear cut. If you rob someone or assault somebody, that's quite clearly an act of aggression against them. But when it comes to how we affect our shared environment, again, this is an area that's probably a little bit more in the murky grey areas, a little bit closer to the fuzzy edges of voluntarism, which is one of the reasons why I thought it would be such an interesting subject to explore. And we'll get into more sort of specific details with this as we speak about this. But just to give a very brief overview, my position is that the non-aggression principle does provide for environment, or does allow for environmental protection to a certain extent, and this can't be based on any kind of aesthetic preference, but rather that mandate of causing harm or loss to others. And basically, we all kind of share this environment. We all live on this planet. Nobody owns it exclusively. And as a result of that, none of us have the right to destroy vital parts of the ecosystem that we all depend on, that for not just for our persons, but also for property owners and stuff like that. Just to give really extreme examples, my right to build property is both defined and restricted by the non-aggression principle. So I can build where and when I want, as long as I'm not interfering with other people. But to give a really extreme example, if I decided to build a house next to my neighbour that blocked out the sun onto his property, that would be an example of an area where I'm interfering with his property, even though I'm not physically stepping onto it, I'm affecting the environment around him in a way that's potentially causing him harm. Similar things to like levels of pollution. I don't have the right to destroy natural resources through pollution or things like that. And one other thing this does connect to, which is something that I think we'll sort of speak about in most detail here, is land ownership. Because one of the things that's often put to me is the issue of land ownership. Because when we talk about property rights, the way people obtain rightful ownership of property is through creation of voluntary trade. Basically, if you make something with your own bare hands, again, not violating the non-aggression principle along the way, then you own that rightfully. That's an extension of your own self-ownership. You've used your labour to create it. And just like self-ownership dictates that we own our actions, both good and bad, we're responsible for the crimes that we commit, and we are owners of our actions. And when our labours create something new, that is our rightfully owned property. But the issue of land ownership, some people often question this because obviously no one created the land. It is kind of part of our shared environment. So people ask how land ownership is derived. And my personal position, and I'd be interested to hear what you have to say about this, Daniel, is my personal position is land ownership itself, as in land ownership per se, isn't really allowed for by property rights, but it's not also necessary for property ownership, because even though you don't have to, and the example I think I gave when I messaged you about this was, just like you don't need to own the land beneath the feet that you stand. So I'm just standing in any given spot. I don't own the land beneath my feet, but I own myself. And while I stand in this area, I have rightful domain over this area. If somebody else tried to invade my personal space or push me off the spot that I'm standing, that would be an obvious act of aggression. So even though I don't actually own that land, because I own myself, I have dominion over that land while I stand there. And my position is that basically the same applies to property. If I rightfully own the house I build or whatever the property is, obviously it's got to go somewhere. It can't just float in the middle of the air. And I can put that on land, again, as long as it's not causing, as long as I'm not blocking somebody else's house and stuff like that. And we'll also touch on things like preclusion and how that relates to the non-aggression principle. But, with all things being equal, as long as I'm not aggressing and violating the non-aggression principle along the way, I can build my house anywhere. And even though I don't actually own the land per se, I have a dominion over it that basically serves the same as land ownership in regards to me having that exclusive dominion, and in regards to the fact that it is obviously connected to something that I do rightfully own, i.e. my property. But like I say, it might sound like a technicality to say, well, I don't own the land, but in a way I do. But I think it's important because I think it's another way of understanding the principle more specifically. Because, as I say, I don't think you can actually own the land, although you can certainly mix your property with the surface area and make it property and own it in that sense. But just by putting your house on some land doesn't mean you own the land that it sits on, but that becomes the domain of your rightfully owned property. You rightfully own your land, you rightfully own your property, your house or whatever it is, and therefore you have that exclusive dominion over that area. Does that make sense how I've explained it?
Yeah, it makes sense to me for sure. And I think it's a pretty interesting idea. One thing I would want to do, I think, is lay a little bit of foundation or background for people who are very new to the issue of property rights, particularly ANCAPs, if I may. And then I'll jump into evaluating your proposal, basically, or your thoughts right there. But the reason we're even why is this even an issue? A lot of ANCAPs, myself included, when we first got into the game, let's say, land ownership and property rights was a very cut and dry thing. It was yeah, of course, you can own whatever. You can own land. You can own hundreds of acres of land, but only after very long and drawn out discussions with those of opposing views, which you and I have both been engaged in for several years now, at least, particularly communists. Even a broken clock is right twice a day. And they do bring up a valid, I think, criticism. And that is that there are scarce resources, and let's say there can be a tendency for what's called rent-seeking behavior, or basically the trying to exploit a resource and get people to pay homage to you as if you were basically a state, almost in a sense, while not having actually done what is typically required, or what is not fair. You don't want people acting like little states and exercising power over other people just because of an arbitrary claim. Like, for example, you can't just point to the moon and say that's mine, and now anybody who ever goes there owes me taxes, right? Because you'd basically be a state, and that's exactly what the state does. And this is why we're interested in determining what is rightful ownership, because a lot of statists will say, well, the government owns this, and that's why they can do whatever the hell they want. So we want to prohibit or very much restrict the conditions upon which people are able to say, I own this, I have total domain over this, and anybody who's on it has to obey me. So I agree with your premise that you can't just claim something, for sure. And this is going to run contrary to what a lot of, I think, even libertarian type people believe, that they can just own like 500 acres or something like that. I don't believe that, because it's arbitrary. You can't just say that you own something and it's yours. It's like, why? Well, why can't I override that? Why can't I say that I own it? Like you said, ownership comes from you doing something, because we own our actions, and then our actions become invested in something. Like if you build an object like a spear from natural resources, it's kind of reasonable that you own that. So I'd actually never encountered the idea that you can't just own land like what you had just described. I think it's actually a pretty useful way of looking at things, because right there, baked in there, is the requirement that you have to do something. Now, I think a debatable or ambiguous example would be like farms, for example, because that is basically like you owning land, but you have to be like farming on it, obviously. A house, I think the most useful way to sort of evaluate an idea is through examples. I mean, I know we're supposed to reason through first principles, but that can be pretty hard sometimes when you're on the gray areas. So let's take your idea, and let's say like you have a backyard, right? Like I have a pretty small backyard. I could run across it in about 20 seconds, but land is scarce, and it's basically just grass that I cut, or have somebody cut it once a week. What if somebody wanted to build like a shack on that? Would that be justified? Because like all I do is cut the grass, and there is an argument that like somebody should not be able to just take a tractor and drive it across the countryside and say, well, look, I put labor into this, is mine now, right? That would be an example of rent-seeking behavior. Like you're clearly just doing that so that you can exercise power over this piece of land. You're not actually using it. So something like that, does somebody's claim to having a backyard, for example, or maybe, I mean, there are a lot of people in the U.S. who have this, government granted, or let's say government observed ownership over like 10 acres. That's a lot of land. I don't know what that translates to in square kilometers, but it's pretty darn big. Like it would take you a long time to run around that perimeter. So what do you think about that? Is that justified to own, 10, 20, 30? Some people own a ridiculous amount of land in the United States and elsewhere. What do you think about those property claims?
Yeah, no, it's great questions. I mean, basically, because what we're talking about here is, like you say, this is arbitrary claims. It's where someone just kind of says, okay, well, this big area, this is mine, and just kind of pointing to it. And obviously that's something that government has done, but even, private interests have done similar, or obtained sort of land ownership that kind of way. So it's a great point. I kind of have there's two kind of approaches to when it comes to things like farmland or even gardens, because obviously what I was talking about with regards to, well, even without owning the land, you've got domain over the land beneath your feet, and likewise the land beneath your rightfully owned property, like your house or whatever. But then to most people's minds, well, that only works for what's directly under your house. And, what about a garden? What about a what's name? And there's two kind of approaches I have to that. One is I don't really, and I don't know if you agree with this, but I don't personally subscribe to the idea that your property, again, domain ends a millimeter from, like, the edge of your house's wall. Just like your self-ownership doesn't end a millimeter from your face with regards to things like this. There's a concept known as personal space that we can kind of understand. And again, this does cry back a little bit to what we were talking about in our last conversation when it comes to things like rational standards. At a certain point, you've got to have a sort of rational standard. And even though I don't own the air that's a millimeter in front of my face, but if you invaded that, even without actually touching me, then that's still an invasion of my personal space. So I think that a certain level of personal space to allow you to function is not unreasonable as an extension of your self-ownership. And I think you can apply that, again, the same thing to your property, which would allow for like a garden and stuff like that, because you can allow for that workable space. You need to be able to walk. You can't just but that's one aspect. But then the other aspect also is, there is, like I said, I mentioned briefly when I was talking about, obviously, you mix your labour with property to create a property and sit it on a land. But you can also mix your labour with the surface of the land and kind of make it your property. Again, you don't own the land underneath it and what have you, but you are mixing your labour with that surface area. So if you were, like you plant crops, for example, and cultivate an area in that regard, like the mixing with labor doesn't have to always mean that you're swapping grass for concrete. It doesn't always mean that you have to be swapping natural materials for synthetic materials. You can mix your labor with natural resources without completely converting that natural resource to something that's completely 100% synthetic and man-made. Cultivation of a lawn would be an obvious example. Cultivation of crops would be again. And again, that's where I would say that things like farmland comes into it. So a farmer can still farm an area, and where they're mixing their labor with that area, that is their property in that sense. Again, they don't actually own the land beneath it, but where they're mixing their labor with that kind of surface area, that is becoming their property. And again, it's still, just like with everything else, it's still restricted by, their obligation not to violate others, and they still can't do it to the point of actually destroying the environment to the detriment of other people's persons or property. So you still have that limit on it. But those are the two areas. As I say, I kind of have two approaches depending on specifically what we're talking about. You've got that area around your property, which again has to be limited. I can't just extend my garden, and again, this is where rational standards comes into it. I think when I was speaking to Walter Block about this, I kind of used the example of, well, if I build a house on the edge of the rainforest, can I declare the entire rainforest as my back garden and as part of my property? And obviously, the arbitrary nature of that becomes obvious when you kind of extend it to such a ridiculous degree. But it also reveals the principle. And again, it ties back to that continuum problem that we talked about before, where, we know it's right here and we know it's wrong over here. There can be debate over exactly where you draw the lines. And again, I think that's something that is its own problem. But the basic principle is there. It's about guarding against arbitrary claims of ownership. Obviously, all government claims of ownership are immoral because of the fact that they use force and coercion and what have you. But even a private entity that made such similar arbitrary claims over massive areas of land and natural resources, the reason those claims are arbitrary is because they haven't met any requirement for property rights. They haven't mixed their labor with it. And, particularly if it's a large and vital part of the local environment that other people's persons and property depend on, then, destroying it in any kind of way or claiming ownership, which, can kind of lead to the same thing, would be an act of aggression against them. So does that all make sense, what I said there?
Yeah, it makes sense. And, I'm guilty of, I did want to listen to that discussion with Walter Block. I can't believe I haven't done it, but I wonder if you'd be able to paraphrase real quick what his position was and if you two were able to come to any kind of common ground. Because if I'm not mistaken, he believes that you should privatize every inch of land in the entire world, which I think he's taking some liberties there. So how did that go?
Yeah. I mean, it was a great conversation. I think we still kind of disagreed. I mean, it was an hour-long conversation, and we were still kind of. I don't think we. I think it could have gone on a little bit longer, but he allotted an hour for me, and I was very grateful for him to have given me that time. I mean, basically, his Walter Block's a little bit sort of famous for his mantra of privatize everything. If you ever get an email from him or a correspondence from him, he always writes at the bottom, if it moves, privatize it. If it doesn't move, privatize it. And as if everything either moves or doesn't move, privatize everything. And a lot of people, including Walter Block, kind of point to this as a good way for environmental protection, because he kind of points out that, people own these areas, they're more likely to look after them, and you don't have this tragedy of the commons. And, we already see what a mess government makes of things they're supposed to be looking after. So I can certainly see the rationale in why he thinks, from a utilitarian point of view, private ownership of everything might actually serve to protect certain areas. But I had a few objections to it. One of the problems I had was there's a little bit of a paradox when it comes to environmental protection through private ownership, because as we've mentioned before, obtaining rightful ownership of property involves mixing your labor with it. In the case of natural resources, you can't preserve natural areas
Right.
And mix your labor with them. There's an obvious contradiction there. It's like, if I want to leave this natural area in its natural pristine state, that's great, but then I've failed to meet the requirements of homesteading and what have you to actually claim rightful ownership over it as my property. So there was one immediate kind of paradox there that I just thought, well, you can't really resolve that, because, as I say, the homesteading requirements to actually gain rightful ownership of something would kind of make it impossible to preserve it. Also, it does tie into that arbitrary nature. I mean, it's hard to imagine, even in a practical sense, how anybody could make claim over oceans and like I say, in rainforests and lakes and stuff like that in anything other than an arbitrary way. Because again, unless they, can transform it to the point of pretty much destroying it, or at least destroying it as to what it was, there's no way of actually, doing the labor mixing requirements to actually meet the property ownership claims. So that's one issue I had. There's also a few other issues I had. The other issue I had actually connected to something that Walter Block himself had already established. And again, I did sort of speak to him about this, and he confirmed that this is something that he, rightly believes, and I believe he's right about this. And this is the issue of preclusion. And basically, his position is that it's a violation of the non-aggression principle to preclude people from anything other than your rightfully owned property. Just to give an example of, the example he used was, he basically said, look, you can't homestead a donut-shaped ring around an unowned area or over an area that's owned by somebody else, because in both instances you would be precluding somebody from something that you don't rightfully own. If you surrounded somebody else's property with your own property, then you're basically trapping that person inside their own property, because they can't leave without trespassing on your property. And if you did it just around an unowned area, like say you decided to homestead round a lake or something like that, then you're precluding people from an area that you don't own, therefore have no right to preclude them from. Now, I completely agree with Walter on this, but I also think that in a way kind of invalidates the idea that you can privatize everything, because if you privatize everything, you're basically creating, on a much larger scale, obviously, the same problem as the donut-shaped homesteader is. If you own everywhere, then nobody can move anywhere without trespassing onto the private property of other people's. Whether it's one person that owns everything, or what would be a more likely scenario is everything is owned but by different people in different places. The fact of the matter is you would never be able to escape the arbitrary rules of property owners. And in a sense, as you alluded to yourself, this would end up becoming like a quasi-state, or again, more likely, many quasi-states where you literally cannot escape the rules of others because they have that rightful ownership of property. And like I say, that's one area where I think he laid the groundwork for that, because he spoke himself about how you can't donut shape homestead for the same reason. I actually said, well, it's the same reason why you can't own everything, because it would create the exact same problem. And this is why I often point out, and I like to emphasize this, not just when I speak to people like ANCOMs and stuff like that to explain to them property rights, but even when I'm speaking to many ANCAPs, I think ANCAPs often need to remember that property rights is both defined and restricted by the non-aggression principle. You know, it's the non-aggression principle and the concept of self-ownership that gives us property rights in the first place. So we can't allow property ownership to then violate the non-aggression principle. And that's why I say, you know, you can build your house, but not in any way that's affecting my personal liberty or freedom. And I don't, because again, this is where you said about how a broken clock is right twice a day in reference to commie logic. But this is an area where they have a semblance of being right, but then they take it to ridiculous extremes. And a perfect example of this, I was speaking to someone the other day who was talking about a conversation they had with a commie who basically said that and this was their rationale for why they say all property is theft, because they were basically saying, look, you know, if I want to walk in a straight line, your property is in my way, therefore, you know, you're interfering with my freedom. And this is where we come into the idea of rational standards, because that's like if I'm just standing somewhere, you know, like in the middle of a field, you know, talking unowned areas now, commons or whatever. You can't say that I'm blocking you on your journey just because if you walked in an exact straight line, you would bump into me. You might have to deviate a couple of feet, you know, on your journey. That's, again, this is when we talk about like reasonable, rational standards. That's not me interfering with your right to travel. However, if me and my friends all join hands in hands and surround you, then obviously that is preventing you and blocking you. And again, it's so many things I find when we talk about issues with regards to voluntarism, so many things connect to other things. And as I'm talking about land ownership and the environment and how property rights applies to that, I realise this connects to things like the continuum problem, where again it's obvious at that extreme and it's obvious at this extreme. There might be some debate in between, and it's like even with the ring homesteading. Okay, you can't homestead a complete ring around me, but you can certainly build next to me. You can certainly build to the north of me and the south of me and the east of me and the west of me and the northeast of me and the northwest of me. But you can't build in a complete circle. So then someone would say, okay, well, how much space do I have to allow you to pass freely? And again, that's where we touch on that continuum problem, where reasonable people can perhaps have a discussion over precisely what is, an intolerable obstruction of your right to move or to travel, to leave your property, or to access other areas. So again, it does come into that area of rational standards again, but this is an area where, like I say, the commies take it to ridiculous extremes and they ruin any potential good point they might have with their properties theft nonsense. But because like I say, saying that I'm interfering with them because my house blocks them from walking in a straight line is just as ridiculous as saying I'm interfering with them because where I stand happens to be blocking this straight line path that they want to walk. But again, like I say, while that might be ridiculous, it wouldn't be ridiculous if I literally did stop them from moving by surrounding them with my friends or what have you and blocking them in that way. And the same applies with property. If I built all around so they can't move, then I am aggressing them. If I build in a way that's damaging the environment, which, like I say, which is shared environment that we all own and none of us have a right to destroy, then again, I'm violating the aggression principle. So again, it comes into that area of reasonable interpretations, and I know that's not ideal because it does kind of lend itself to subjectivity, I suppose. But again, the principle is objective. Sometimes we do have to take a rational approach to certain things, but I still think the principle stands untouched in its objective nature, because you're still wherever you think the exact line needs to be drawn, that basic principle is still the right. Are you interfering with other people's persons or property? If not, if that's definitely not the case, then you're definitely not violating the non-aggression principle, and you can build where and when you like. But as soon as you are getting into that area where people say, well, hang on a minute, you're blocking out the sun on my property, or you're polluting the air around me, or you're destroying that lake that you have no right to because you're dumping toxic waste in it. And these are sort of examples of things I'm talking about, where people's property rights and people's rights, their right to mix their labor with the natural resources and use natural resources, is limited by the fact that they have to do so in a way that doesn't aggress against their fellow person and doesn't destroy the environment that we all share and none of us own, or really can own rightfully.
Mm-hmm. Can you hear me, by the way?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay, having some mic confusion. A lot of stuff there, but what I will say, basically, I think the principle that I sort of distill from all of this is that there is definitely no perfect property ownership scheme, whether that's capitalism, communism, whatever it may be. And this is going to be the case anytime you have natural resources, simply because nobody created natural resources yet. Some people are going to use natural resources. So one might say, well, why not give everybody equal, access to everything? Like, let's say pure communism, meaning you can go wherever you want, you can use whatever materials you want. Well, this is the other extreme, right? We've been worrying about prohibiting people's ability to use what is natural and to roam freely, basically. We don't want to infringe on that. But on the other hand, you don't want to infringe on other people's labor and other people's legitimate property. That's the other end of the spectrum. And you will do that if you allow people to go wherever they want, do whatever they want, consume whatever the hell they want. So it's finding that balance. And personally, I think you and I, of course, naturally, I think that we're right. But, it is a balancing act. And they're like, just by existing, you are definitely imposing an incremental loss on everybody. Like, for example, I love just like wandering through nature and just looking at miles and miles of like untouched forest and hills and valleys. That's a beautiful, wonderful thing. But if that were covered in houses and roads and highways, I would not want to look at that. But hey, guess what? People have to exist, and I have to exist. I'm not one of those primitivists, who believes that we can't have society. So, and that's okay. We need to release this insistence on perfection, and that can be a stumbling block for particularly anarchists who are striving for perfection, which is a good thing, but you have to know where to draw the line. So definitely, like, even having many like, let's say micro states, tiny 2-3 acre areas where somebody has domain, that is like infinitely better than having even a small state, like a typical government we have nowadays. Like, if you go up in an airplane, you will very quickly get a sense of the scale of the world that we live in. Like, for example, I live in a place called Michigan in the United States. And when you go up and fly, if you were to fly like the perimeter of Michigan, you would be like utterly amazed at how much land is there. It's giant. Yet we have, and that would be the size of like a average European country, let's say. And the idea that one entity, like called the state of Michigan, or just another country in Europe, would have the right to impose rules on such a giant territory is clearly absurd, when you realize the merits of anarchism. So considering that most property owners in a free society, in a voluntarist society, would only have something on the scale of like less than 1 acre, and also considering that most people are going to live in cities in like a tiny apartment just because they want to, because people like to be in civilization, I think we're already at least 100 times better off than having like statism. So I'm comfortable with a certain, drawing the line and being reasonable and saying, yes, people can have backyards. You could even have your own personal farm, and we'd still be, insanely better off than what we are now. We could all have a reasonable amount of land, even, with the world as populated as it is, with people's preferences to live in cities and the amount of farmland and grazing land. Like, we're still quite comfortable. Now, we're not comfortable with the government basically restricting us and creating these massive prohibited zones where nobody's allowed to do anything and you have to fucking beg permission to do anything. I'm experiencing that right now. Like, my dad owns some property, and he's been in like a year-long battle just to like build some houses on it. So like the shit that we have to deal with thanks to the government is a far cry from what we'd have in a free society. So yeah, that's kind of where I draw the line, is to say, yeah, it's clearly unjustified for you to say that you own 100 acres. Like, that's absurd. You did not create those 100 acres. If someone were walking through those 100 acres, you don't get to shoot that guy. And this is something that like hardcore, let's call it like right-wing ANCAPs, Hoppian ANCAPs, the types who like to make jokes about throwing commies out of helicopters. Those people need to come to grips with the fact that, like, yes, I know you grew up thinking that you can own like the national, park forest. It's like this, you could own like the giant sequoias and everything. I'm sorry, you can't. But you definitely can own a factory. You definitely can own your house and a generous territory around that. So I guess that's kind of my conclusion is I think your prescription that you can't just own land, but you can own land that's been processed and the things that are sitting on land. I think that's actually quite a good and reasonable summary, basically, because the idea that you can just own land means that you can own pristine, untouched land, which means you haven't touched it, which means how did you actually homestead it? The only challenge I see is what you alluded to earlier, which was how do you protect areas which you don't own, right? Like, you can't, if we follow this rule and you can't own things you haven't touched, what about like a nature preserve, for example? And, personally, I don't really have much of a problem with people establishing nature preserves. Like, a community may encircle like a forest or something, and they say, look, we want this forest, or better yet, like, let's say Yellowstone National Park or some like very rare natural resource that everybody likes, like some beautiful mountains or something. Or no, better yet, the rainforest, a scarce resource. Yes, people want to use it and cut down trees, and this is an area where, honestly, I think there is no right answer, and I do struggle with that as well. Like, I think people can establish nature preserves, but we can't just say you're not allowed to log, you're not allowed to, cut down trees. I'm curious where you would come down on the issue of, I mean, like, do you have a resolution? You alluded to this conflict earlier of environmentalism, or is it just going to be one of those things that's on a case by case basis and it'll be decided by local communities and people will have to come to reasonable standards at some point?
Well, I mean, I think, again, reasonable standards will be invoked. I think we're going to have that with so many things because of the continuum problem that we spoke about before. I think you're going to have that kind of reasonable approach to things when it comes to drawing precise lines. But there is still that clear distinction, which you alluded to, the difference between an arbitrary claim of ownership where you're just kind of pointing to something and saying mine, and the more the actual proper attainment of ownership the property rights dictates, where you're actually mixing your labor or voluntary trading with somebody who already has, but that basically that creation or voluntary trade way of obtaining ownership remains valid. The fact that it's restricted by the non-aggression principle in the sense as, well, as soon as you start affecting... Now, the way this sort of ties to things like natural areas is because, like things like the rainforest, I think, are a little bit easier to deal with because it represents a vital part of the environment. Like, the destruction of the rainforest that's actually happening at the moment, in my opinion, is a clear violation of the non-aggression principle because it's being destroyed and it is essential for the environment. Like the destruction of it is, I mean, apart from the fact that there's indigenous people living there, so they're obviously, the aggression against them is obviously very obvious, and their property rights of where they live and all the rest of it. But even people around that area, and even on a more global scale, I think what it's about, and again, there is this rational standard that comes into play, which, like I say, lends itself to subjectivity a little bit. But the actual principle is still objective, because the principle is whether or not you're causing harm or loss. So, for example, say I was homesteading, say, near a natural resource, and you wanted to try to make the claim that I was aggressing in some way because I was damaging the environment in a way that was causing harm or loss to others, either their persons or properties. You would have to establish that. Just like any activity that I create, you would have to establish, okay, you're aggressing against me because you're causing me harm in this way. It's like it's separating the difference between like a reasonable action and an act of aggression. Even though the distinction is clear, there's that blurry line that we spoke about with the continuum problem. But the principle was still clear. Once you're causing, sorry, just to deviate again. One other aspect as well, because a lot of people look at it and say, well, how can we protect natural resources if no one can own them? Because no one can own them to protect them. But it's like, well, the fact that no one can own them is what protects them, because you can only destroy what you own. So if you don't own it, you don't have a right to destroy it. So when I talk about like these natural areas, like say you've got a big lake or a rainforest or whatever it is that you want to protect, you can't just protect it for aesthetic purposes. You can't just say, well, that looks pretty to me, so I'd like to keep it there. What you need to do is you actually need to be able to establish a way in which the destruction of that is actually causing harm to another person or property. So like I say, if you start using the local river as your personal sewage dump, and that's also, the river that I get my drinking water from, it's like I say, it's a natural resource. You don't have the right to do that. You don't have the right to destroy that natural resource. You have the right to use it. And this kind of ties to something else, which ties to my kind of whole attitude with regards to the whole, and this is something the Water Block questioned me on actually as well, because when I was saying, you can't own everything, and you say, okay, so if you can't own everything, these little pockets that you can't own because, we still have to give people the right to move, and, like we can't, enclose people's property and all that sort of stuff. What happens to those areas? What about the lakes? What about the rainforests and that? How do we protect them? What is their status? If it's not owned, what is it? And my position is well, it's unowned. It's it's the commons. And I know a lot of people talk about the tragedy of the commons because nobody owns something. Then how do we protect it? But my position on it is the fact that nobody owns it is how we protect it, because the fact that nobody can own it is exactly why nobody can destroy it. You can only, if you build a house, that's your property. That's your rightful own property. You can do with it what you like, including destroy it. So you can just, you can burn it to the ground if you want. Again, not in a way that endangers other people. You can't blow it up with a nuke that damages other people. But again, this is. But I know that sounds like a facetious comment, but at the same time, this highlights the principle that we're talking about. It's that basic principle of you can do what you like until you start interfering and aggressing with other people and infringing on their rights, to do the same. So I do think there is room in a free society for what we would call the commons. And my position is that rather than saying that we need to own these, someone needs to own them to be able to protect them, I would actually say, well, no, the fact that no one's allowed to own them is what protects them, because these natural areas and these natural resources, because it's part of our shared environment, and again, this is where there's a slightest little hint of validity to the commies position. It is our shared environment. None of us own it. None of us can own it, and because of that, none of us are allowed to destroy it or damage it in a way or prevent other people from using it. And we all have a right to use it. We all have a right to drink from the the fresh water from the lake. We all have a right to go into the rainforest and collect resources, but we have to do it in a sustainable manner. If we do it in a manner that destroys the whole area, then that's when I say we're stepping beyond the limits of what property rights allows. And I think, again, like I say, I still think that there is that continuum problem, and there is this fuzzy edges where, again, we're going to need to invoke rational standards. And this is why I have that again with my peace agreement, with that whole part 2 about drawing the line, which is the limit of tolerance, because we recognize there's a kind of murky area where we can't say for certain, but there is a limit, there is a line where you cross, where we can say, no, actually, now you definitely are violating the non-aggression principle, because you definitely are causing harm or loss or destruction in a way that's, that's affecting the liberty of others. Does that all make sense?
Yeah, actually, I think I was going to challenge you on something, but I think you answered it at the last second, which was sustainable use of a resource. Because, like, the rainforest, let's say, or the ocean, all these things are natural resources, but they started out huge, and some of them remain huge, like the oceans. The rainforest, let's say, like 100 years ago, people didn't look at that and say, oh, the precious rainforest. They thought, holy shit, this is like a vast, giant forest, and it's not in any danger of going anywhere, right? Especially when there were less people on Earth, let's say 200, 300, 400, 500 years ago. Oh my God, like nature ruled, and you had no chance of, endangering the environment. The environment was endangering you, right? So it has obviously since shrunk by, massively since then, some resources. So, that brings into question, or that presents the question, like, people need to use these things. People do need to cut down trees to create wood. And that is, that's going to kill the tree. But I think the key term is sustainability, like you said. Like, yeah, we are going to fish, but you cannot fish to the point where you've caused like a massive shortage, or you're causing species to go extinct. And yes, some people will say, like, well, well, maybe some idiots will say, well, we're not going to have, this fantastic economic growth. Well, you know what? It's okay that we don't have, sprawling mega cities, just because you're not allowed to deplete, resources forever and kill off species that took, whatever millions of years, and biodiversity that is irreplaceable. So I guess that's actually quite a good standard for how much can you use the commons. Well, don't fuck it up forever. Use it to the point where it's sustainable, it's replaceable, it's going to be like that indefinitely if you use it. Otherwise, if you're going beyond, if you're causing permanent damage, well, then that's not okay. Anything other than that, great.
Exactly, and to be honest, fishing is a really good example. Actually, I should have used that myself, because that's a perfect example. Like I say, you can't own the oceans. There's no, it would be arbitrary for someone to try to claim ownership over it. But so the oceans would be a perfect example of what we call the commons. And my stance with the commons and our shared environment is that it's kind of like, again, without sounding too hippy dippy commie, but the fact of the matter is it belongs to none of us because it kind of belongs to all of us, if that makes sense. Not in a sense of ownership, but in a sense that we all have the right to utilize. We all have the right to breathe the air, but none of us have the right to kind of suck it all in. If that was, if we had well, I know it's not something we can do, but, and I know a lot of these things kind of seem to strike to things that just you don't see happening anytime in the next 100 years. But, like with one of the things that Walter Block said is, well, look, it's probably going to be a long time before everybody actually owns anything anyway. So it's kind of a moot point. But at the same time, it's not a moot point because we still need to tackle the principles, even when we're dealing with obscure examples. But the fishing example is a perfect example of this, because everyone has the oceans are the commons, and we all have the right to utilize the oceans and the resources in there. So we all have the right to fish. But if we do it in a way that completely wipes out a particular type of fish, then that is when we are overstepping that line. And again, sustainable is the key. We all have the right to utilize, but none of us have the right to destroy. And I think that's for me, that is the principle you apply when it comes to the commons. It's for everybody to use, but nobody is allowed to destroy it, because destroying something is something you can only do with something you rightfully own. And again, and that's why I hark back to when people say, well, how can you protect these areas without ownership? I'm saying, well, actually, it's the absence of ownership that protects them, because only when you own something can you destroy it. And if you don't own it, you don't have the right to destroy it. You have the right to use it. If it doesn't, if it's, like I say, it's that common area, we all have the right to fish. We all have the right, to collect wood and other resources, but we have to do it in a sustainable manner, because as soon as we do it in a way that actually destroys that area, that's when we're stepping beyond the bounds of property rights. And that is when our fellow man can accuse us of violating the non-aggression principle.
I guess the last thing I'll say, because we're closing in on an hour here, is just that the logical question, of course, that we're going to get from statists is, well, how do you enforce this? And like, for example, it's not like there's one fishing boat out there that we can easily monitor. There's a ton of like tiny fishermen. So I think my personal belief, and you already see these types of voluntary associations, that I believe that we will see free market solutions springing up. Like, for example, it'll be most likely that fishermen will join a voluntary association of ethical fishermen who, and this is going to be an advertising point to say, like, look, the tuna that you're eating was sourced ethically. We didn't kill dolphins in the process. They're going to have an edge over the guy who says, yeah, I like polluted the shit out of the ocean to get you this stuff, right? The fact of the matter is there's a market demand for sustainability, green solutions. Just look at the market nowadays. It's like a buzzword. People want that shit, and good. They should want that. People demand sustainability. So just because, it's a challenge doesn't mean that we can't do it without a state. I think we can do it much better without a state. So the last thing I'll say is, it's very easy for us to get sort of downtrodden and feel like our position is weak, on the environment. But the fact of the matter is, it's a challenging problem for a society, state or no state. And I still do believe a stateless society is going to handle all of these complexities and challenges far better. So the future, in a free voluntary society is incredibly bright. And that's something I don't want to lose sight of. That we're worrying about like these obscure problems and hypotheticals and things, but just think of it. I think of it as a massive upgrade. It's like, look, do you want this right now, where we have governments like bulldozing people and properties and dumping oil and shit all over the place, or do you want a free market that's much better but not perfect? I am incredibly excited for what the future holds, whether that's seasteading, people being able to do what they want with their property, and the prosperity that we will experience. I think there's going to be a massive improvement all around. And that I want to leave it on a positive note, because I think if we were to implement a rational, reasonable system like what you and I have described, the human condition on this planet would massively improve. And that's something to be very excited for.
Yeah, I agree. But one thing I would add to that, because I don't think we are as weak as we might think we are when it comes to the environmental thing. I mean, I think, I think it's important, and you touched on this in what you said, I think it's important that even though we recognize these, and we spoke about this before as well, it's fine to recognize these fuzzy edges, but that doesn't mean it invalidates the principle. Like that whole desert versus the grassland thing analogy that I often invoke when I talk about the difference between the black and white and the gray areas is like, just because you can identify a kind of murky grey area in between where reasonable people disagree, doesn't mean that you invalidate the distinction completely. Like I said, with the whole desert grassland thing, the desert's still the desert and the grassland's still the grassland, and they're still distinct from each other, even though you might have a geographical region in between where one gradually sort of becomes the other that's harder to define. And likewise, And you know, and again, and this connects to everything. I think where you can cite the continuum problem. You know, when we spoke things about like age of consent, the principle is still clear that an adult can consent and a child can't. And the fact that there might be a murky line in between of exactly where one becomes the other doesn't invalidate the distinction. The fact that you can rightfully own property by, you know, building a house and you're not infringing on other people and you're not damaging the environment is valid. And the fact that you can't just point to the rainforest and say that's mine and I'm going to now destroy it all because I want to put cattle on it or whatever, you know, and that the fact that that is invalid, that distinction is still there. The fact, and again, there's with a lot of these distinctions, there's might be a murky line in between, and that's why that part 2 of the peace agreement looks to kind of draw a line around that and say, okay, we've got a grey area, we'll draw a line around that and we'll leave that to voluntary associations and people to, you know, agree to disagree. But this is the line where we're saying now you are stepping over that kind of threshold. And one other point I will make just before we do wrap up is the other issue I have is when people talk about how will you enforce this, that's actually a separate question. It's not, it's still, you know, it's not an unimportant question. It is an important question, but it's a separate question to the issue of the principle. You know, is it or is it not a crime? Is it or is it not a violation of the non-aggression principle? And then how you can sort of police that, for want of a better word, is a totally different subject. You know, there's a lot of things, there's a lot of crimes that might be hard to police, but the fact that they are crimes isn't changed by that fact. It just means it's challenging for us to, you know, to enforce them. And with everything, it's going to require diligence. But like the example you gave with the Fishermen's Association, I mean, I can still say that, you know, if someone's actually destroying the area and violating the non-aggression principle, you know, this is what the non-aggression principle is about. It's about saying when you can use force to stop someone. So I would say that we don't have to necessarily leave it to market decisions, although I do see the power of consumer choice, you know, coming into play there. But like you were saying about, you know, this is the sort of thing that whether or not people see it as practical to enforce the non-aggression principle in certain situations, the fact of the matter is whether you have the right to. And in the case of this collection of fishermen, for example, that might form an alliance where they want to protect the seas, they can do that. They don't have to own the seas to do it because they can enforce the non-aggression principle as everybody can. And if someone truly is destroying that area, and like I say, if they can actually establish this person is violating the non-aggression principle through their destructive fishing or whatever it is they're doing, or polluting, or, you know, like I say, we can kind of touch this to everything, then everybody, again, this ties back to when people often ask me about, like, well, when I say about enforcing the non-aggression principle as law, and I say, oh, you know, it's one of the common questions I get when I say, oh, I want to establish the non-aggression principle as law, make it the terms of peace, and people say, okay, well, who will enforce it? It's like, well, there's a lot of possibilities over who could and who would and all the rest of it, but the fact of the matter is everybody can. With regards to who has a right to, everybody has a right to. And there's also one other, sorry, just before I do finish, one other little thing I also want to talk about very briefly is the distinction between ownership and guardianship. And this kind of connects to things like, you know, parenthood. You know, I often say to people, you don't own your children, you're guardians of them. You're looking after them. You've taken that, you know, you own that responsibility to be guardians because you brought them into the world, and, you know, so you have that positive obligation, because it's not a positive obligation because you brought them into the world, you know. But what I'm saying, but also, you know, I could choose, you know, if, let's say, for example, we agree that there's this particular natural resource that has to be protected from, you know, whatever. We understand that, but no one's willing to do it. No one can be bothered to protect it. I might say, well, I will. I'll be the guardian of that. I'm not owning it, but I will take it upon myself, just like I can take it upon myself to roam the streets to make sure women can walk around safely without fear of being attacked or assaulted. I have the right to do that, or we can, which would probably be a better idea, have dedicated organisations that do it. like police forces and stuff like that. But the key factor is, because then as soon as you start talking about things like that, well, how's that different to what we've got now? The key difference is
massively different.
It's massively different because the key difference is we're all playing by the same rules. We all have the same right to enforce the non-aggression principle. None of us have an obligation to enforce it. The only obligation we have is to not violate it ourselves. But, none of us are obligated to go out there and stop rapists and stop murderers and stop thieves. But we all have the right to do it. And that's the key distinction. And it's like, and that also applies to anything else that we can identify. And that's why I do personally think that, although I do support voluntarism as a whole, that's why I'm so dedicated to this very specific idea of actually creating voluntarism by establishing the NAPA's law, so that everybody knows where they stand, and it's the same rule that applies to everybody. And that rule isn't just some arbitrary rule that I've made up because that's the world I want to live in, but it's actually built on an objective principle that's just built on the basic reality that we all own ourselves, we all own our actions, and that basic self-ownership allows us to create and own other things and create property and extend our ownership in that way. But just like how what we do with our own bodies is restricted by the non-aggression principle, so is what we do with our property and where we build our property and where we fish and where we do everything else. We all have that equal right to live and thrive. No one has a right to other people's properties, but we all have a right to live in the shared environment that we all exist in.
Yeah, that's perfect, Matt. Actually, I really like how we rounded that off. Is that everybody has the right to enforce the NAP, and that takes us away from having to rely on ridiculous, inefficient governments. Like nowadays, you would not be able to just take action, and people can be armed. I think, like you said, it's more efficient if a dedicated organization does it. But there's nothing inherently wrong with vigilante justice. And it's quite a good deterrent as well. The fact that most people are armed, that, anyways, I can think of all sorts of examples, but there was just one other thing I wanted to say. Yeah, I often get that complaint as well. People say, well, how is this different from a state? If we've crafted a free society that looks like and has a lot of the trappings of our existing society, but the way that you got there is what makes all the difference. Just like an arranged or forced marriage may look like a voluntary marriage from the outside, but one of them is massively better than the other. Just because you have the same rule, it looks similar, just like, there's lots of examples, but the fact
just to throw in a quick example, the mechanics are the same with sex and rape, but there's an obvious.
Yeah, I was going to say that actually, but I didn't want to. But you're exactly right. It looks the same, just like a surgeon and a guy who's stabbing you, right? It's the motivations and the ways that you derived there and got to those things. It's the quality that's going to result is everything. So, with that, Matt, I think that was a very useful discussion. I really appreciate you bringing new perspective and clarity to my views, because this is something I've wrestled with for quite a long time, actually. So very good, very useful, and I appreciate the talk.
Yeah, I appreciate you taking the time. It's a subject I think was worth talking about, and again, just how everything connects to everything else. It all comes back to that same kind of thing of, and it's something that I think not just statists or people that aren't exposed to voluntarism yet, but even many voluntarists and anarchists, I think, need to understand that we don't like. I think a lot of people associate anarchism or voluntarism with a complete loss of everything that we have now, and people need to understand that there's a lot of things that we currently associate with government that we can still have without government. We could actually have a free society that looks, on the very surface of it, almost identical to the society we have now. But that difference is very important. The difference is the equal rights. The difference is the lack of coercion, the lack of a ruling authority, the fact that we all basically have the same freedom of self-ownership, the same autonomy, and the same, restrictions to that in regards to not interfering with each other. And I think that's something that people need to understand, whether we're talking about the environmental thing or any other aspect, police, public services. I often talk to people about things like, socialized healthcare and stuff like that. It's like, you can have anything you want within the realms of voluntarism and the non-aggression principle. But the difference would be to how it is now is it would be done under a voluntary system. And it is, I know it's a kind of vulgar example, but it is the difference between rape and sex. You know, the mechanics might be the same, but the very, very important difference is that no one's consent is being violated, no one's self-ownership is being violated, and it's within that realms of universal and objective morality that the non-aggression principle gives us.
You know how Obama said, if you like your doctor, you can keep your doctor? That was a famous line. Conservatives love to bring that up because it turned out to not be true under his plan. But perfect example, I will say, if you like your government, you can keep your government. You just can't keep the theft, the coercion, and all of that. You can have the same services. So it actually puts the onus on the statists to say, like, look, dude, like, you're the one, like, can't you figure out how to make these very same services run, just not without locking people in jail, just minus the aggression and theft? That's all we're asking for. People think that we want to turn society upside down and like spin it on its head. And oh my God, you want to have, like, you know, little kids selling crack on the street, and we're going to have to pay like a toll just to, you know, breathe the air. It's like, dude, it's going to look very similar. Just minus, you know, the evil shit, and we'll be okay. So good stuff, Matt. Great conclusion.
Thanks, Dan, and really appreciate the talk. Really appreciate it.
All right. We'll talk soon. All right. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.